The carriage had not yet finished settling on its springs when he reached for the door. And he reached for it because he wanted the thing done before courtesy could ambush him. He had his refusal ready before the wheels stopped turning. He had rehearsed it on the road, smoothed it against the leather of the seat, weighed each syllable against the silence he expected to follow. A short bow, a measured sentence about regret, a second sentence about respect, a third, if necessary, about the unsuitability of the season for long engagements. He would not sit, he would not eat, he would not allow the household to lay a single extra plate. He had told his man as much at the last change of horses, and his man, who had been with him since the year he came into the title, had only inclined his head with the unsurprised patience of a person who has learned that dukes who travel light tend to travel decisively. The estate rose out of the autumn weather like something that had decided long ago not to apologize for itself. Pale stone, a wide, plain front, windows set in careful rhythm, neither too many nor too few. There was no fountain in the forecourt, no exaggerated avenue of clipped trees, no liveried flourish lined up to greet him. Only a gravel sweep darkened by recent rain, a single groom waiting with the steady stance of a man who had been told to expect arrivals and not to perform for them. And, beyond, a hedge of yew so neatly kept that it seemed to be holding its breath. He noted these things the way he noted everything. In passing, in the margins of a mind already moving toward the next sentence. He had been taught to read houses the way other men read faces. This one did not flatter. He approved of that, and disliked himself a little for approving, because he had come prepared to disapprove. And a man who arrives with a verdict already written prefers his evidence to cooperate. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of beeswax and apples. A clock somewhere unseen kept time in a low, patient voice. A woman in a plain dark gown, neither servant nor mistress, neither young nor old, came forward with a kind of quiet sufficiency and asked whether His Grace would prefer the long parlor or the library while the master was sent for. He chose the library because libraries told the truth about a household, and parlors told only the version it preferred. She inclined her head, said His Grace was kind to choose so simply, and led him through 2 doors and a passage that smelled of cedar. He thought, in the brief privacy of walking behind her, that there was an economy in this place that pleased him against his will. He had braced himself for ornament. He had not braced himself for restraint. The library was a long, low, generous room with 3 tall windows looking onto a walled garden gone gentle with late roses. Books climbed the walls without showing off about it. A globe stood near the hearth, scuffed at the equator by what could only be the patient touch of a hand passing across it again and again. There was an open ledger on the smaller table, a pen laid clean across its inkstand, and a chair pushed back as if someone had risen only a moment before. He registered the ledger the way a soldier registers a doorway. He did not approach it. He stood instead at the center of the room and let it tell him what it would. It told him, first, that whoever used this library used it. The chairs had been sat in. The carpet under the desk bore the faint, honest wear of feet that had spent hours there. A small spray of dried lavender had been laid between the pages of one volume on the side table, the stem just visible. A pair of spectacles rested on a third book, folded with care. The fire had been laid, but not lit, because a fire had not been needed. The room kept its own warmth by being lived in. He had stood in too many libraries that existed for the painter and the visitor. This one existed for whoever it belonged to. He resented faintly how much he liked that, and resented himself more for resenting it, because resentment was already an admission. A footman came in with water and biscuits he had not asked for and would not eat, and went out again without conversation. The clock in the hall struck the hour with the kind of clean, unhurried strokes that belonged to a household where clocks were wound by someone who took the winding seriously. He did not sit. He went instead to the middle window, and there, standing a step back from the glass so that the garden would not know it was being watched, he allowed himself a single, unprofessional breath. He had come, in the end, because his name required him to come. The arrangement had been made by his father and her father in the way such arrangements were made, with letters that were polite about everything and honest about almost nothing. And his father had died before the matter could be unmade. And her father, by all accounts, was a man who kept his word the way most men kept their valuables, with care, and at a slight distance from his daily life. He had inherited the title, and the arrangement, and the obligation to come in person and end the thing kindly, because to end it by letter would have been an insult that no future generation of his house would be permitted to forget. He had agreed to come because he was a man who paid his debts, even when the debt was inconvenient. And he had agreed to refuse because he was a man who knew his own mind. And his mind had concluded, on the strength of one miniature portrait and 3 second-hand reports, that the young woman in question was unlikely to suit him. She was said to be quiet. She was said to read. She was said to have refused 2 earlier suitors, gently, and to have given no reason that satisfied either. He had decided on the road that a quiet woman who read and gave no reasons was a woman who would either bore him within the year or wound him within 5, and he was disinclined to volunteer for either fate. He had also decided, less generously and more honestly, that he did not wish to marry at all. Not now. Not on a calendar set by ghosts. Not into a house he had never seen, with a name he had only inherited the weight of. He wanted a year. He wanted 2. He wanted to learn his own holdings before he tied another family's fortunes to his decisions. He had imagined on the long ride that this refusal would be a relief to everyone involved, that her father would be courteous, that the household would be courteous, that he would be back in his own saddle before the early dark, and that some other man, in some other autumn, would do the proper thing by the quiet young woman who read. He had not imagined the garden. It lay below the middle window with the unflashy precision of a thing that has been thought about for a long time, by a person who is not in a hurry to be admired for thinking. The beds were laid in long, soft rectangles, edged in low stone, and within them the planting had the look not of design, but of patience. There were late roses, yes, but there were also herbs gone slightly wild at the edges, a row of espaliered fruit on the south wall, a square of plain turf left deliberately bare to give the eye a place to rest, and, at the far end, a small glass house whose panes caught the cold light and held it like a held breath. A robin sat on the rim of a stone basin and did not move when a gust of wind passed through the yew. He watched the robin a moment, because there is always something to be learned from what does not flinch. Then he saw her, and he did not yet know she was her. She had come out of a low door at the far end of the walled garden, the kind of door servants used, and she carried in her arms a wide, shallow basket that looked, even from this distance, heavier than her frame suggested it ought to be. She was dressed plainly, in a color that might have been brown, or might have been the green of moss in shade, and her hair was bound back simply at the nape, with no ornament at all. A maid he took her for, at first, because she walked the way maids walked when they had a task and did not expect to be noticed, which is to say, without performance. He almost turned from the window. He did not turn from the window. He told himself afterward that it was the basket that kept him there, the slight, telling tilt of her shoulder against its weight, and that may even have been true at the beginning of the looking. She set the basket down by the stone basin, and went to her knees on the path. There was a child there. He had not seen the child until she went to her knees, because the child had been sitting very still in the lee of the yew, and stillness in a small body is a kind of camouflage. The child was perhaps 6, perhaps 7, dressed in clothes too rough for the house and too good for the village, and the child's left hand was bandaged in a thick, awkward wrap of linen, that even from above he could tell had been done in a hurry by hands that loved more than they knew. The child had been crying. He could see, in the way the child held the small bandaged hand away from the body, the particular bravery of a child who has decided not to cry any more in front of strangers. She did not, he noticed, fuss. She did not coo. She did not gather the child up into the kind of theatrical sympathy that adults perform when they wish to be seen comforting. She set herself down on the path as if she had all the afternoon in the world, and she reached first, not for the bandaged hand, but for the basket, and she lifted from the basket a clean cloth and a small bowl and a smaller jar and a folded square of fresh linen, and she laid these things out on the stone of the path in an order so practical that he understood, watching, that she had done this before, and recently, and more than once. She spoke to the child. He could not hear the words, he could see only the shape of them in her face. She said something that was not a question. She said something that was a question. She waited. She said something else, and the child, after a moment, nodded and held the bandaged hand out toward her with the trembling slowness of a small creature offering up the worst thing it owns to a person it has decided, against its better judgment, to trust. She unwound the wrap with a patience that he found he could not look away from. She did not pretend it would not hurt. She did not lie. She said something brief, and her free hand, the one not unwinding, settled lightly on the child's knee, not to restrain but to anchor, the way a person steadies a small boat at a dock. When the last of the linen came away, he saw, even at that distance, the dark line of a cut along the base of the small palm, and he saw the child flinch, and he saw her not flinch, and he understood then something he had not been prepared to understand on this afternoon or any other, which was that whoever this woman was, she had been taught not by a governess but by use, and what she had been taught had taken. She washed the cut. She did it with the bowl and the cloth and a quietness that turned the path briefly into a room. She bent close to look, and her face, as she looked, lost every social arrangement and became only attention, the kind of attention a craftsman gives to a joint, the kind of attention a reader gives to a sentence that matters. From the jar she took something pale, a salve of some sort, and she spread it along the cut with the side of her smallest finger in a single steady pass. She folded the fresh linen into a pad. She laid it. She wound the new wrap, neither too tight nor too loose, and she tied it off with a small practical knot at the back of the child's wrist, where the child would not catch it on anything. Then, only then, when the work was done, she sat back on her heels and looked the child full in the face, and she said something that made the child laugh. He had not expected the laugh. The laugh traveled up through the cold air and reached him at the window like a struck bell, small and clear, and it did something to the room behind him he could not afterward describe, except to say that the refusal he had carried in like a sealed letter began very quietly to come unsealed. She sat with the child a while longer. She did not stand up at once and bustle away to her next task, which would have been the move of a woman performing kindness. She stayed. She let the child lean against her arm. She pointed, with her chin, at the robin on the basin, and the child looked, and the robin looked back, and none of the three of them moved for what must have been a full minute by the clock he could no longer hear. Then she rose and she gathered her bowl and her cloth and her jar and her dirty linen into the basket with the same unhurried economy, and she took the child by the unbandaged hand, and the two of them walked together back along the path, not toward the low servant's door, but toward a different door, a wider one, set into the side of the house. He realized only when she reached it that the child was not a servant's child, and that she was not a servant, and that the door she was opening was a door he himself would have been led through if he had asked, on arrival, to be shown to where the lady of the house could most usefully be found. He stepped back from the window before she could glance up. He did not know whether he stepped back because he did not wish her to see him watching, or because he did not wish himself to be seen, by himself, watching. He stood in the center of the library, with the open ledger on the smaller table, and the globe with its worn equator and the spectacles folded on the third book. And he understood, with the cold, precise clarity that came to him in counsel, and in grief, and in any moment that mattered, that the ledger on the table was hers, and the globe was hers, and the spectacles were hers, and the lavender between the pages was hers, and the household that smelled of beeswax and apples and kept its clocks honestly was, in every way that signified, hers, and had been hers for longer than her father probably knew. The door opened behind him. He turned, composed, with the refusal still folded inside him like a letter he had not yet decided whether to send. Her father came in first, a spare, courteous man with the careful eyes of someone who had learned early that the world rewarded those who listened more than those who spoke. He bowed. He apologized, with grace, for the delay. He said that his daughter had been detained by a small matter in the garden and would join them presently, if his grace would permit. He gestured to a chair. He did not insist. He offered wine that was not pressed upon refusal. He spoke of the road and the weather and the harvest with the unforced ease of a host who had nothing to prove and therefore proved a great deal. The Duke answered as a Duke answers. His sentences arrived correctly. They were the right length. They contained the right small courtesies. Somewhere inside him, the refusal he had carried for 200 miles was, very politely, asking to be let out. He did not let it out. He told himself he was waiting only to be civil, that one does not refuse a daughter without first having looked at her in the same room, that to leave before the introduction would be an insult the house did not deserve. He told himself, also, that he was a man who made decisions on evidence, and that he had not yet, strictly speaking, gathered the evidence he had come for. He told himself a number of things, in the careful interior voice of a man assembling a defense he is not yet aware he is constructing. Then the second door opened, and she came in. She had changed her gown, not finely, only into something a shade better suited to a parlor than a path. Her hair was still simply dressed. Her hands, he noticed at once, had been washed but were not soft. They were the hands of a person who used them. She did not curtsy too low. She did not glance at her father for instruction. She came forward the distance that good manners required and stopped, and lifted her face, and looked at him with the same attention he had watched her give the cut on the child's palm. The attention of a person prepared to see what was actually there. Her eyes were the color of weak tea in afternoon light. Her mouth held the faintest, courteous, almost smile of a woman who has not yet decided whether smiling is warranted. He bowed. He said her name. He used the right title and the right cadence and the right small pause afterward. He felt, as he straightened, the refusal in his chest turn over once, slowly, like a sleeper deciding not yet to wake. They sat. The conversation that followed was, by any measure, ordinary. They spoke of the journey. They spoke of the late roses. They spoke of a piece of music that had recently been much praised in town, and which she had not heard, and did not pretend to have heard. He had braced himself for cleverness pretending to be modesty. He met, instead, modesty that did not need to pretend. When her father asked lightly whether she had finished the morning's letters, she said she had not, and gave no excuse, and did not blush, and offered in the same breath to finish them after supper. When the Duke, testing, asked her opinion on a small political matter that he expected she would deflect, she deflected, but not in the practiced way. She said simply that she had not read enough of the recent dispatches to have an opinion she would be willing to defend, and that until she had, she preferred not to lend her name to one. He had not, in 3 seasons in town, heard a young woman say that sentence. He had heard a great many young women say its opposite, charmingly. The talk moved. Tea came. The light in the windows began its long, slow autumn slide toward gold. He found that he was not looking at the clock. He found that he was, instead, listening for the particular quietness she brought into a sentence before she answered it, as if she were laying her words down on the path the way she had laid out the cloth and the bowl and the jar. He found, with the dry, internal astonishment of a man discovering that a road he has traveled for years has a turning he has never taken, that he was no longer rehearsing his refusal. He was, instead, listening for the next thing she would say. The child appeared once, briefly, at the parlor door. The bandaged hand was tucked carefully against the small chest. The child looked at her, not at the Duke, and she lifted one finger, only one, in a gesture so small and so private that he understood it at once. Not now. Soon. I have not forgotten you. The child nodded, with the gravity of a courtier receiving a royal sign, and withdrew. Her father, who had seen, smiled to himself and said nothing. The Duke, who had also seen, said nothing either, because what he wished to say he did not yet know how to say, and because he had been raised, like her, to prefer silence to a sentence not yet earned. When the light had gone properly gold, and the first lamp had been brought in and set, with quiet ceremony, on the small table by the window, her father rose and said, with the courteous tact of a man clearing a stage, that he had a matter or two to attend to before supper, and that his Grace and his daughter might perhaps walk a little in the long gallery if they wished, or sit, or do whatever the hour suggested. He bowed. He went out. The door closed behind him with the same well-oiled discretion as everything else in the house. They did not walk in the gallery. They sat, instead, by the window, at a small distance proper to people who had only just met, and improper to people who had been promised to one another by their fathers. And she asked him, without preamble, whether he had eaten on the road. He said he had not. She said, then he must be tired in the way that pretends to be patience. And she rang a small bell and asked for bread and cheese and a little of the pear preserve. And when these came, she did not apologize for their plainness. He ate. He had not, on arrival, intended to eat anything in this house. He ate 2 pieces of the bread and a spoonful of the preserve, and discovered, with a private, almost embarrassed pleasure, that the preserve had been made in this kitchen by someone who understood that pears wanted only a little help to be themselves. She asked him, then, with the same direct, unflinching attention she had given the cut, why he had come. He had prepared, on the road, for many questions. He had not prepared for that one in that voice. He looked at her. She did not look away. She was not, he understood, asking in order to trap him. She was asking in order to know, because she did not wish either of them to spend the evening pretending around a thing that was already in the room. He felt the refusal in his chest turn over again, and this time it opened its eyes. He said, with a slowness that surprised him, that he had come because his name required it. He said, with more slowness, that he had come prepared to ask, with all the courtesy he could manage, for the arrangement to be set aside. He said, and this he had not planned, that he had come because he believed he knew what he wanted and what he did not want, and that he had wished to be the one to say so face to face rather than by letter. He stopped. He waited for her to be hurt, or offended, or relieved. She was none of these things. She was, instead, attentive, in exactly the way she had been attentive to the child's hand. And after a moment she said, quietly, that she was glad he had come in person, because she also did not wish to spend a life inside an arrangement made for her by people who would not be living it. He drew a breath he had not known he was holding. He said, carefully, that he had expected to refuse before supper. She said, just as carefully, that she had expected to be refused, and had prepared for it, and that she would not have held it against him. Then she looked down at her hands, which were folded in her lap with the same economy she had used in the garden, and she said, with the faintest of smiles, that she was, however, mildly curious as to why he had not yet refused. He almost laughed. He did not laugh. He said, instead, the truest sentence he had said in a year. He said that he had stood at the library window when he first arrived, and that he had seen her with a child by the stone basin, and that he had watched, without meaning to, the way she had tended a cut, and that something in the watching had made him understand he was not, in fact, in possession of all the evidence he had thought he was. He did not say more than that. He did not flatter. He did not declare. He named the moment, plainly, and he set it on the table between them, the way she had set out the cloth and the bowl and the jar. She was quiet a long time. The lamp on the small table burned steadily. Somewhere in the house, the clock that kept time honestly struck the half-hour. When she spoke, she did not thank him, because she was not a woman who thanked people for telling her the truth. She said only that the child was a tenant's child, that the cut had been got on a broken pail that morning, that she had been the nearest grown person with clean hands, and that there was nothing in what he had seen that he had not also been raised to do. Only that perhaps in his house, such things were done by other hands. She did not say it as a rebuke. She said it as a fact a person lays down on a path. He took the fact. He did not flinch from it either. He said then the sentence he had not come to say. He said that he would not, this evening, ask her father for her hand, because he was not yet in a position to ask anything he could answer for. But, he said, after a pause so short that only she would notice it, that he would, if she would permit, ask her father for something else. He asked her, with a gravity that startled him and did not startle her, whether she would object if, before he left in the morning, he asked her father for more time. Not for a betrothal, not for an announcement, only for time. Time to come back. Time to be in this house again. In daylight, without a refusal folded inside his coat. Time to learn whether what he had seen at the window was a single afternoon or a life. She considered him. She considered him the way she had considered the child's hand, with attention that was neither flattering nor cold. Then she said, simply, that she would not object. She said, also, that if he asked for time, he should mean it, because she would not be available after this to be the courteous fiction of a man who had not yet decided what he wanted. She said it without sharpness. She said it the way a person tells the truth to another person who has shown, in one afternoon, that they might be the kind of person to whom the truth can be told. He bowed his head, only a little, in the smallest acknowledgement. He said he would mean it. He said it in the voice he used for promises he intended to keep. Her father came back. Supper was announced. They went in. The meal was plain and good and unhurried, and the talk was of small, real things, the harvest and a bridge that needed mending and a neighbor whose cow had calved twins. And no one mentioned the arrangement. Because the arrangement, in the way of all real arrangements, had already begun to be remade in the room without anyone having to declare it. After supper, the Duke asked, with the proper formality, if he might have a word in the library with his host. Her father, who had been waiting for some such request all evening, and had given no sign of waiting, inclined his head and led the way. In the library, with the fire now lit because the evening had asked for it, the Duke did not sit. He stood, instead, in the place he had stood that afternoon, near the middle window, where the garden was now only a darker dark beyond the glass. He spoke briefly. He did not flourish. He said that he had come with one intention and was leaving with another. He said that he would not, tonight, ask for what their fathers had once written down between them, because he was not ready to ask for it honorably, and he would not dishonor either house by asking for it otherwise. He said, however, that he would consider it a kindness, and more than a kindness, if her father would grant him time. Time to return. Time to be known here and to know. He said, looking steadily at the older man, that he understood he was asking for a thing he had not earned, and that he was asking it anyway, because the alternative was to leave in the morning and pretend, for the rest of his life, that he had not stood at this window that afternoon and seen what he had seen. Her father was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, with the same unforced ease with which he had spoken of the harvest, that time was the one thing a father with a daughter like his had learned never to refuse to a man who knew enough to ask for it. He said it without ceremony. He poured 2 small glasses of something amber and handed one across, and did not propose a toast because the matter was not yet a matter to be toasted. They drank in silence, like 2 men who understood that a contract had just been quietly torn up, and a different, smaller, truer one written in its place, in pencil, to be inked later if it held. He left in the morning, early, in a colder light than he had arrived in. The forecourt was the same. The groom was the same. The ewe was still holding its breath. She came to the door to see him off, with her father a respectful pace behind, and she did not pretend to a feeling she did not yet have, and he loved her, in that instant, for not pretending, although he did not yet use the word even to himself. He bowed over her hand. He did not kiss it. He said only that he would write, and that he would come again before the first hard frost, if she would permit. She said she would permit. He mounted. He rode out under the arch. He did not look back until he had reached the turn of the lane, and when he did, the house had already gone back to being itself, pale and plain and unflattering. And the small bright figure at the door had gone in, because she was a woman with letters to finish and a child's bandage to check, and she had not been raised to stand on a step waving at a man until he was out of sight. He came back, as he had said he would, before the first hard frost. He came back again at midwinter, with a small, sensible gift for the child, and a larger, sensible gift of grain for the tenants whose pail had broken. He came back in the spring, with no gift at all, only with himself, and by then the ledger on the small table in the library had a second hand in it sometimes, in a careful square script that was learning the household's columns. He asked that spring the question he had not asked in the autumn, and she answered it with the same attention she had given the cut, and her answer was yes. And her answer was also a number of small, plain, practical conditions about the running of her father's house after she left it. And he agreed to every one of them, because every one of them was the reason he had asked. They were quietly married in a small church at the edge of her father's land, on a morning so ordinary it might have been any morning. And the child with the once bandaged hand carried a posy of late primroses with the gravity of a small ambassador. And the robin, or another robin, sat on the rim of the stone basin in the walled garden and did not move when the bells rang. The gatekeeper aunt, who had, by letter, predicted disaster all winter long, was obliged, at the wedding breakfast, to admit, with the wry composure of women of her generation, that she had perhaps been mistaken in one or two particulars, and she was forgiven, in the family way, by being given the best chair and the largest slice of cake. The two earlier suitors, hearing the news, were reported to have received it like men who had narrowly missed a train and were not sure, on reflection, whether they had wanted to be on it. Her father, who had granted time and been repaid in it, lived long enough to teach his grandson the proper way to wind a clock so that it told the truth. And that grandson, in turn, grew up under the impression that all great houses smelled of beeswax and apples, and was disappointed, later in life, to discover that most of them did not. And if you have ever stood at a window with a decision already made in your pocket, and watched a stranger do one small, unwitnessed, ordinary act of care, and felt the decision in your pocket quietly unfold itself and ask to be read again, then you already know how this story ends, because you have lived the moment it turns on. We do not, most of us, change our minds because someone argues us out of them. We change them because we are allowed, for one unguarded afternoon, to see a person being who they are when they do not know they are being seen. Tell me, if you will, which moment of this one stayed with you? Was it the basket set down on the path? Was it the laugh that traveled up to the window like a struck bell? Was it the sentence about time, asked in a library at dusk, by a man who had arrived with a refusal already folded in his coat? Pull your chair a little closer to the fire. There is more wood in the basket, and the night is long. And I have another story ready for the next time you come and sit with me here. Until then, sleep gently, and may the people who watch you, when you do not know they are watching, see in you what he saw in her. Someone quietly, unshowily, being kind. Good night, friend. Good night.